Well, good morning. I appreciate you all coming early in the morning. My name is David Kugler, and I'll make some introductions in a moment. This panel is going to discuss local government support and state legislative support as required by the Texas QAP and its effect on the ability to develop affordable housing, especially in high opportunity areas, which we'll sometimes refer to as HOAs, so don't confuse that with home ownership associations. I'm going to introduce the panel. My name is David Kugler. I'm the moderator. My background is I'm president of Mark Dana Corporation. We develop, build, and manage multifamily properties, primarily affordable multifamily properties using the low-income housing tax credit. My background is that I went to law school in Virginia at Washington and Lee. I have an engineering degree. I practiced law in Houston for about 20 years and then got into this business. I'm also a member of the TAP board. With me today, I've got Bobby Bowling. And I'm apologize, but I'm going to read some of these intros so I don't make a mistake. But Bobby is a third-generation home builder from El Paso. His grandfather began building single-family homes in El Paso in 1950. The Bowling family has been providing homes to El Pasoans continuously ever since. Exclusive to the El Paso area, Tropicana Homes, owned by Bobby and his younger brother Randy, has built over 10,000 homes since its inception, mostly in the affordable market. In 1999, it was actually a natural for Bobby to begin submitting applications to TDHCA for tax credits. Since that time, Bobby's Tropicana Building and Tropicana Property entities have been awarded 28 9% LIHTC deals, all in El Paso County, totaling just under 3,000 units. In the past 17 years, Bobby has seen numerous versions of the QAP and witnessed several policy shifts. The biggest being the recent shift from encouraging the location of LIHTC developments in poor QCT areas to locating them in high-income HOA areas. Bobby is the current Government Affairs Director for TAP and the incoming president of TAP, taking office in August. Bobby is going to give us an overall view of state requirements for state and local government support of housing developments and their effect on affordable housing. Next up is going to be JP Delmore. JP is an Assistant Vice President for Government Affairs at the National Association of Home Builders. JP's legislative focus is tax policy. He has worked for NHB since August 2003. Prior to joining NHB, JP spent nearly 5 years on Capitol Hill and also served as the Deputy Director of the Governor of Pennsylvania's Washington office. JP grew up outside of Cleveland, Ohio, and graduated from the University of Michigan with degrees in international relations and German literature. JP is going to give us an overall view of the national scene and look into or talk a little bit about HUD's requirements to affirmatively further fair housing. Following JP will be Bill Longling. Bill is the legislative counsel at the Texas Municipal League. Bill graduated from University of Richmond in 2004 with a degree in political science and sociology. In 2007, he received his law degree from the University of Texas School of Law. Bill worked as a law clerk at TMI while in law school. Prior to joining the TMI legal department, Bill served as an assistant attorney general in the Open Records Division of the Office of Attorney General. In his 7 years at TMI, Bill has worked on a variety of legal and legislative issues as they relate to Texas cities. He co-authored the TMI Revenue Manual and TMI Economic Development Handbook and has spoken on numerous topics with a focus on economic development, municipal revenue, open government, and elections. Bill is going to give us an overall view of the municipal perspective and what cities can and cannot do with respect to development of housing. We're also going to cover and discuss kind of the overall view of NIMBY, not in my backyard, and changes that are needed to the state's QAP to address local support and issues. I think the panel is going to generally address those issues as they talk about various parts in their presentation. Originally, we had Charlie Duncan was scheduled to be on the panel. Unfortunately, Charlie's come down with an illness that his doctors think is the West Nile virus. So he can't join us today, but he was instrumental in preparing for this panel. We'll miss him. I think he would have added an interesting component, especially from the point of view of all the survey data that he has. So let me introduce him even though he's not here. Charlie is a fair housing planner with the Texas Low-Income Housing Information Service. He collects data from federal, state, and local governments and provides research and mapping pertaining to housing, neighborhood qualities, and the socioeconomic conditions of municipalities across Texas. His work informs numerous stakeholders in housing-related policy, including legislators, law firms, community organizations, local and state agencies, academics, and advocates. He also sits on the board of directors for the Austin Tenants Council. Charlie has a Bachelor's of Science in Geography with emphasis in urban planning and GIS from the Texas State University. So with that, we'll start our discussion. I think our format's going to be each individual is going to give a presentation, but panel members are free to interrupt with questions, and so it'll hopefully turn into a bit of a discussion. The audience is welcome to ask questions during each of the presentations. I ask if you have a question that relates to a specific project that you're working on, that you hold it till the end and just come up and talk to one of the panel members that you'd like to discuss that with after the session's over. And then if we have time, we'll have 5 or 10 minutes of question and answer at the end as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first panelist, Bobby.
So good morning, and thanks for attending here. I wanted to start out by saying we had allocated about 10 or 15 minutes for each of us to go through our presentations, and with Charlie gone, I think we'll probably each take the full 15 minutes instead of the 10, so just be forewarned on that.
Maybe 20.
Maybe 20. I did want to touch on the fact that I've had the opportunity to, as the TAP Government Relations Chair and the incoming president for TAP, I'm in the role of kind of reaching out to the different groups on behalf of our association and behalf of our industry in large. And I had the opportunity to sit down with Charlie and his colleague, John Henneberger, who I've known for about 20 years. And oftentimes, I was telling my colleagues in preparation for this meeting this morning that oftentimes we're somewhat at odds with that group from time to time as developers and members of the for-profit industry that's generating this housing, and sometimes that conflict or that kind of discussion revolves around deep income targeting in our projects and trying to help the poorest of the poor, and then our natural inclination is, well, we do want to help those people, but our main concern is that the project is feasible, and with the lower rents that we have to go to, a lot of times that's just not. It's not going to make our deals work if we do 60% of our units for 30% AMFI families and lower. But when I met with Charlie and John Henneberger a couple months ago, I couldn't have been more pleased that we're so united on this one issue of removing the political uncertainties into our application evaluation process, removing some of the just really ugly and actions that are violations of the intent and the express language of the Fair Housing Act. And it was just such a positive meeting. I was really excited that Charlie was going to be here in front of our developer group so you all could share that same perspective that I got to share in meeting with Charlie and John Henneberger. So I'm disappointed that he's not here, but I do want to express that to you all, that these guys are 100% our friends, the Texas Low-Income Housing group that he's a part of, and we have a lot of sometimes not always natural allies that are our allies in this fight. So anyways, I want to just preface with that, and then to talk about the individual issues that I wanted to touch on. There's basically 3 items that are the end-all, do-all to our applications at this point in Texas. The state rep letters, the city county resolutions, and the neighborhood letters of support or opposition, and all of those either way, support or opposition. If you've got support for all three of those things, you can go forward with your application. If you've got opposition on any one of those three, you're just dead. You're wasting your time. You should just save your money and just not even put the application together. And we all know that. And Charlie had some really good data and statistics, and he had done a survey on the pre-applications, especially from this round, the ones that had been submitted and then withdrawn and not submitted for full application. And he had a lot of data and a lot of anecdotal feedback from our community about how that was a direct result of, well, I put in my pre-application, then I went to go meet with my city council or my state rep, and I realized there was going to be some pushback. So I just decided I'm just not even going to go for it. And these were good deals, deals that meet HUD's guideline of affirmatively furthering fair housing, meet TDHCA's goals of putting these deals in high opportunity areas where our lower income families would go to good schools and be around good economic factors and job centers and things like that. But because of the political subjectivity and the unquantifiable and unknown for all of us as developers, you could be in for a real fight even if you win. And in my case, when I see that kind of opposition, and I'm sure this is the norm and not unique, even if you win, you've made some political enemies. And like when I do all my business in one county and really mostly one city, I can't afford to have those political enemies because I have to work with them no matter whether I think they're wrong, and it's probably borderline illegal what they're trying to do and killing my project with regard to the Fair Housing Act. You just have to throw up your hands and just say, well, I'll just live to fight another day. And so Charlie had a lot of data and a lot of survey data about that that he would share, and I'm sure we can probably get you that information if you're interested. He shared it with Frank Jackson and myself, and we can get that to you if you're interested at TAP. So if you want that resource and you want that kind of stuff, and you're interested, we can share that with you. But getting back to the NIMBY points in our legislation, so those state rep letters, city county resolutions, and neighborhood letters are in our legislation. Our guiding legislation in 2306 in the state of Texas. So it's not that TDHCA wants to do this stuff. They have to do this stuff. We're in the QAP roundtables, and from time to time someone will bring up, well, we don't want to do the state rep. TDHCA's hands are tied. They have to put that stuff in there. So and I wanted to give you some background. We were talking this morning, where did these things come from? Well, I've been doing this, like I said, since 1999. The state rep letters were, along with the state senator letters, they were always in our QAP. And the state senators actually kind of revolted one session about 6-8 years ago, and they said, we don't want to be in this anymore. We don't like this. We have constituents that want us to oppose these deals on a lot of fair housing violation reasons. And then we have these developers who are a lot of times our friends and to be honest, a lot of times big campaign supporters, and we're being pulled in two different directions. Sometimes these grassroots groups are a lot of good voters and they don't want one of these projects in their district. And then we have these developers, and we really know that the goal of what they're doing is good and noble. And we just want to be out of that. We almost got the state reps out that session, but at the very end, one particular state rep really had a lot of power and was smart, and she maneuvered her way back in. The way it works in the Texas legislature is a bill has to pass with 3 readings. And in the first reading, the state rep letters were out. The second reading, the state rep letters were out. And the third reading, on the third consecutive day, it got put back in there, and that's what we got stuck with. So we think that though we can maybe, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but just to give you the background, I think there's an opportunity to get that out. The city county resolutions, again, one of those unintended consequences. How that came about was in the sunset legislation for TDHCA, all the state agencies have to undergo what's called a sunset review every 10 years by the legislature to make sure that what they're doing is relevant and that the agency should continue to exist. I believe it was in 2010 that this took place, or 11, and TDHCA got it pushed back another session, I think, till 2013. But in the Sunset Review Committee, there's interim hearings, and what one of the findings was they had was that there wasn't enough local control in the QAP process. So the state legislature decided that having these local resolutions was a way to have more local control. Well, sounds noble, sounds good, but what has happened with that is that the process has been hijacked by these NIMBY forces, by these 200 residents in a good voting district that comes to city or county commissioners court or city council meeting or in their office and wants them to kill this deal. I want you to kill this deal is what these groups come forward and say. And so again, now you have these politicians going, I don't know, I met with Bobby, and that's really a good deal. It's a mixed income deal. They have all these social services. It's needed housing in the district. It's right next to these warehouses and industrial facilities where all these people can work, and there's all these grocery stores and all these amenities, and the schools are great. Yeah, but we want you to kill the deal. And so it's a tough deal, and maybe Bill will talk about a little more where the cities and counties are coming from on this, but seems to us that they don't want to really be pulled in that direction either. Then the neighborhood letters, I mean, it's kind of funny how things work in the legislature or in Congress. Sometimes just one motivated guy can get something in a bill that becomes law and becomes a rule. And there really was that instance with this neighborhood support letters. I believe it was in 2003. Again, there was a push for kind of more local input and local support. And it came from a Republican state rep from San Antonio's office, and he was just really into this. The neighbors should have a say. Again, a well-intentioned thing. The neighbors should have a say in what's coming to their neighborhood. Well, that sounds good, but what that has become and what has been hijacked into is exactly my anecdote. Like, I want you to kill that deal. There's very few neighborhoods that are going, yeah, that's great. We want that. We think that's great. We want a bunch of poor people to go to our schools, and there's just not that. People aren't that noble. They're fear of the unknown. Those people, we tried, no matter how much we try as developers to go, those people are all of us people. There's no difference between those people that are going to live there and my kids and your kids and all of. But so that's kind of the background with where that came from. So having said all that, those are, as we as developers struggle with, those are unquantifiable items. We can't put a price on that. We don't know where we stand. Everything else in the QAP, I think there's 25 scoring items. The other 22, you can sit back in your planning, and we as developers and planners, we need certainty. We're making multi-million-dollar decisions, and we need to know what the lay of the land is going to be. So you can go through our QAP, and you can say, well, I'll do good here and here and here and here, and I'll score this. And then you have this nebulous, these three items that you really have no idea. You can have a sense of it. And even to put a pre-application together is a lot of time and energy. You've got to control a piece of land. In some instances, we don't have the leverage to not buy the parcel of land, even if it's just a pre-application. We have to buy it, or we have to put substantial, option fees and earnest money up. So we're trying as an industry to make this a focal point for TAP, to carry legislation that will eliminate these three uncertain items. We have some good fortune and timing on our side. The Urban Affairs Chair is a woman named Carol Alvarado. She's a state rep from the Houston area. She is incredibly enlightened about this issue. She is very sensitive to the violations of the Fair Housing Act. She is very aware of the ICP lawsuit that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and she wants to protect the state of Texas from that type of litigation in the future. And she really wants to do the right thing. Really core in her heart, she wants to do the right thing. She believes in what we're doing. She gets it, that providing housing for people who make less money. These are great people, and they need. This is what the United States of America is about: is helping people help themselves through this type of workforce housing, rise up through different income strategies. She's a true believer, and so we have an ally with her. The rest of the Urban Affairs Committee, this is the House committee that has oversight over TDHCA. It's the Urban Affairs Committee. And they had a hearing, I think it was in May, in Houston. They had their first interim committee hearing on the charge. They were tasked with the charge from the House Speaker of taking a look at TDHCA and as it relates to fair housing and the ICP lawsuit. Are they falling in line with recent court cases and have the rules in the QAP proportionate to and what they should be doing with that lawsuit? So I had the opportunity again to testify. It was invited testimony. I testified on behalf of TAP, and I was so pleased with how well educated the committee was to a person. They all were aware of our issue. They asked intelligent questions. One of the state reps, another one from Houston as well, made a little speech about how he doesn't think it's fair that all of us have to get so many approvals for our tax credit developments when the same piece of land, if we were doing a regular apartment complex, we don't have to have public hearings. We don't have to have city council hearings dedicated to resolutions of support or opposition for our deals. And he was spot on. He was, this is not right. We need to fix this. And this is a pretty conservative Republican from Houston saying these things. So it's across both aisles that we have support on this. Like I said, I think it's good timing and a little luck. We're extremely fortunate the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor are sensitive to these fair housing issues. The other thing I wanted to just touch on a little bit is the affirmatively furthering fair housing, and I'll let JP talk about that a little bit more, but that's a new concept that HUD has, and I don't know that really all the cities in Texas truly get the gravity of what that's about. Affirmatively furthering fair housing is totally different than defending yourself against a Fair Housing Act violation, and that's what the cities and the counties in Texas and probably around the country are used to dealing with in their mind in those terms. Well, are we overtly being discriminatory? Well, in this day and age, and probably every city in America, no. We don't do that anymore. We don't say put those people of color over there. But there's the implied and the unintended consequence of your actions as government are leading to redlining or discrimination. And even further, what are you doing affirmatively to prevent that from happening as a city? Now, I know in my city, in El Paso, they're putting together a little mini QAP for us in El Paso for us to apply for future consideration of city council resolutions. And they're still kind of oblivious to how heavy and the weight of this affirmatively furthering fair housing issue is. They're looking at, we have a place called the Segundo Barrio. It's like the second ward in El Paso, which was developed, 80 years ago. And it truly was in our city when there was discrimination. Let's put all those people over there. And when our city is looking at revitalizing those areas, they're not really getting it that those are redlined areas to begin with. And that's what HUD's looking at. You can't just keep dumping poor people into something that maybe not this city council, but in 1940 or 1950, there was an overt action to put these people here and rich people here, and you can't do that anymore. And so, what are you doing to further the goals of fair housing by eliminating that redlining and that discrimination? So, and my colleagues will talk about that more. Really, I just wanted to say one more thing, and I'll close with this. At these interim hearings, and the Senate has a similar committee that has oversight over TDHCA. I'm talking about the Texas Senate. It's called the Intergovernmental Relations Committee, or IGR. they're going to hold their first interim hearing on this. And interim hearings are the hearings that happen between one session in the legislature and the next. They only meet 6 months every 2 years. We're in between that session right now. We're in the interim. So they hold these hearings. At the House interim committee hearing, there was probably 30 or so members of our industry. Not all spoke, but they were in the audience. And it was a totally united front. And it's so powerful when elected officials see that there is no other view about this NIMBY thing. That everybody, whether it's nonprofits, for-profits, housing authorities, all of the ancillary people in our business are all united on this. This NIMBY thing is wrong. So if you have stories and you have anecdotes, and I have a few from my own experience, please come forward and share those with us. The more stories and the more kind of things. It's funny how lobbying works. It's just a lot of times an anecdote or two that hits home with a state rep or a state legislator. So if you've got some stories and some bad NIMBY things or some bad city council actions or county commissioner or a state rep, please come forward and contact Frank Jackson at TAP. And you don't have to put it in writing, but just call them up and have a discussion and say, hey, look, I know you're looking for kind of NIMBY stories. I've got one, and let me lay it out for you. So we can kind of convey those behind closed doors and help push the ball forward. Like I said, we're going to try to pass a bill that strikes all three of these uncertain items in the legislature. But to get anything through the Texas legislature is incredibly difficult. It's got like one life and a million ways to kill it, procedurally and all kinds of different things. So we need your help. When the IGR committee gets announced, we're going to put that up and advertise it on our website. If you're in the area, it'll probably be in Houston. But wherever it is, if you're in that area, if you could come and show support, that would be outstanding. So with that, that's what you can do to help us push the ball forward in this issue. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, David, and I'm available for questions.
Great. No, I think you covered most of this, but I know you said the timing seems to be good to try to get these three things deleted from the legislation. I develop in Virginia as well, and Texas, compared to Virginia, has a lot of legislated rules to the LIHT process. You don't see that in Virginia. I'm not sure how the other 48 states handle things, but I know it sounds like a good time to approach this. What do you think the likelihood is that we'll be successful?
Well, at the end of the House Urban Affairs Committee, it seemed like all 151, I think, House members were probably on our side in my mind. But since we floated our bill, and I've actually looking for a sponsor on behalf of TAP, it's been brought to our attention that there are some state reps around the state who want to maintain their vote and want to maintain basically their veto power in this process. I still think it's better than 50-50, and I think we have to try. Even if it's a 20% chance at the end of the day, we have to try because it's right. And it's just such a hard thing for us to deal with. But I still feel very optimistic, to answer your question. I think the tea leaves are better than they've ever been for this issue to try to get these items removed.
Great. All right. JP?
Thank you. It's always interesting to hear how a state legislature functions compared to what I deal with in Washington, D.C. We make everyone else look good.
I don't know.
So,
I know about that.
Yeah, certainly seems that way. Good morning, everyone. My name is J.P. Delmore, and I'm here on behalf of the National Association of Home Builders. Certainly, if you had a chance this morning to catch my colleague Rob Dietz, who's our chief economist, you have, I think, a little sense of some of the multifamily focus that we have. I do know that we have more of a reputation as a single-family organization, but I can tell you from an internal perspective that is definitely not the case. We have a very large an active focus on the multifamily side. And within NHB, we have a very boisterous group of housing credit group developers, and have a special group where I work directly with them on formulating some of the issues that we want to push for on Capitol Hill when it comes to the low-income housing tax credit, and there's certainly been no shortage there. My focus as a lobbyist is actually on the tax side, so the NIMBY issues is a little bit outside of my normal focus area, but it's something that we have been looking more and more at the last, really this year. Part of that, I have to admit, is because of Texas. There has seemingly been a wealth of NIMBY challenges occurring here that we've been hearing about, and so we've started to look into some of the options and how we can respond and help our members respond to what's going on. But what I want to do is present a little bit of a national perspective of some of the trends that are going on and coming down, and perhaps offer some hope as well as some ideas for how to deal with some of the challenges you're facing here at the state and local level. I'm actually going to try to be a little bit optimistic. You tend to give presentations on legislative stuff, and it tends to go a little more pessimistic, but I think there is a reason to have just a little dose of optimism in terms of some of the opportunities we have to actually go on the offensive against the NIMBY push. And I don't think we've really had an opportunity to turn the tables and start to put pressure on the other side. A large degree that's coming from, as Bobby mentioned, HUD's new emphasis on this affirmatively furthering fair housing, which I still have trouble saying without twisting up my tongue, and it's harder this early. People also call it AFFH, which I don't think is any easier to come out. I'm still trying to figure out, in DC we like to make words out of acronyms, but I've tried to sell it. It's not sold so far. But if I get desperate, if the coffee hasn't kicked in, I might go to that. So I am a political animal, and I do tend to view everything through how do you advocate for something when you're trying to push an idea. And I do think that we have an opportunity to tap into some of the undercurrents with the presidential election. If you look at whether it's Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, they've tapped into something in the American public that's really touching on the sense of inequality or a lack of opportunity within the country, that you used to be able to go and make something of yourself, and because of whatever barriers are out there that they're identifying, and they're obviously identifying very different barriers, but it's the same type of message if you actually strip away some of the political undertones. So I think we can tap into that a little bit and use the media's new focus on this topic and use it to our advantage. Rob Dietz, if you listen to him this morning, he talked about one of the challenges we face in just driving affordability isn't always about how you do a subsidy and how you put it together a project. It's that a quarter of the cost of new development is regulatory. And part of that is the development process of whether it's getting the letters through in addition to the environmental and the traditional regulations that we think about. And we need to put more focus on that message, because that regulatory message is something that resonates across party lines. It doesn't put people in their political corners. The Republicans in particular are always going to be sympathetic if you start talking about something from a regulatory standpoint and say there's so many regulations on this process, it's driving up my costs and I can't meet the goals. There was a really interesting article right before the 4th of July in the New York Times that focused on NIMBY issues, but they actually took this line of focus of looking at how land use policy was creating economic divides in this country. And one of the things that they talked about is you can take a place like San Francisco, which has a booming economy and has a $13 an hour minimum wage, which I would have killed for. I think when I was in high school, I made like $3.15. $13 a minimum wage. But the only people who really can move to San Francisco and take advantage of that are college graduates whose parents already have a place where they can live. And that notion that you can move to where the jobs are has really disappeared in the country. So the New York Times ran this piece, which is interesting because some of our members are using a new phrase, and maybe it's not new, but it was new to me, but no zoning, where there's actual communities where it's not zoned at all for any multifamily development. And so they can't come in, they can't even begin to approach the affordable process. And I think part of it is for us to start telling this story about how land use policy, how regulations all add on to create additional barriers to affordable development. But I also think it's always great when you have the NIMBY folks interviewed in the media because they tend not to come off as well as they hoped. So they interviewed this one guy. Most of the piece focused on Boulder, Colorado, which is probably not the best place to focus on. But it actually ended with him being quoted as saying, "Go somewhere else where they need you." And that's the kind of statement we really need people to understand and make them defend it. Defend how you can actually tell that to someone who's coming to your town looking for a better opportunity, go somewhere else. It reminds me of the old joke, you may have heard it, the difference between a developer and an environmentalist. The environmentalist has their house in the woods, the developer is trying to build a house in the woods. So this notion of, I'm here, I like it, stay out, that's the traditional NIMBY approach. And how do we actually go about combating that? So part of it, I think, is using the media to our advantage, and I think they're particularly receptive to this message right now because of the greater political discussion that's going on. So I mentioned, and I'll go back into HUD's new focus on affirmatively furthering fair housing. So it's going to require every state and local government receiving federal development funds, such as HOME and CDBG, to go through a process which includes reviewing their own policies and to not just have affordable policies on the books, but to show that they are being proactive in creating housing opportunities and removing barriers to housing choice. So there's going to be this new focus on affirmatively. They actually have to be stepping up and doing something, not saying, well, you can build affordable housing here, so we're good. That's not going to be adequate anymore. This process is already underway, but we're not seeing a lot of activity yet. We're going to see a lot more activity next year when some of the states will start to have to go through this assessment process. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to figure out when Texas is going to have to go through. Interesting, no one seems to quite know yet. But it could start next year, so keep your eye on this. When they go through this assessment process, they're going to have to do these public hearings, and it's going to be an opportunity for us to engage and to start to highlight, if you're, depending on where you are with your push for some of these legislative changes, to use this hearing process to go in and really push for these ideas. This isn't without controversy. There definitely is a lot of controversy about how these things are being pushed, and of course, you might be suspect of anything that HUD is so deeply engaged in, and I understand that, but it's going to happen, and we have an opportunity to help drive the agenda and advocate for some positive changes. What I have heard, I mentioned Texas has been, at least within NHB, driving our internal discussions about looking at NIMBYism again, particularly on the multifamily side, is this local approval process that you have to go through. You're certainly not the only state, but it is much more intense here. And I think that using the AFFH process, these hearings, will be a real opportunity to advocate for change. But there is also other pressure coming down, particularly focused on this local approval process. 2 weeks ago, before Congress recessed for the summer, Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington State, along with Senate Finance Committee Chairman Orrin Hatch, who's a Republican from Utah, and the top Democrat on the Finance Committee, which for me is the Tax Rating Committee, so it does everything low-income housing tax credit related. So the top Democrat, Ron Wyden, who's from Oregon, is actually a reintroduction of a bill that had been introduced earlier this spring. You may have heard of it. The main component of the bill is to increase low-income housing tax credit allocations by 50% and to fix the 4% credit rate. But this new version that they just introduced has a whole series of legislative fixes in it. And one of them would ban outright state QAPs from including local approval or local contributions as either a threshold requirement to receiving the allocation or for the basis of points awarded to an application. So it's becoming more of a common acknowledgement that this local process is creating a barrier for what we're trying to do. And if the states aren't going to act, then Congress is going to try to act. I personally would probably be more optimistic of your chances in the Texas legislature than in the United States Congress in the short term, but I think there's a good chance, at least in the medium term, which I would define as 1 to 5 years, if the states don't act, of pushing this forward. A lot will depend on what happens in November with the elections. In addition to this, another interesting thing that we've been following is coming out of the riots in Baltimore. There was already an ongoing lawsuit dealing with Baltimore County and affordable housing in there. And with the riots putting an unfortunate focus on what's happened in Baltimore, HUD was able to settle this case that, as I mentioned, was already under litigation with Baltimore County. HUD claimed that Baltimore County had failed to affirmatively further fair housing. So not the first time you're going to hear this. But a large part of this involved the segregation that was occurring, where all the affordable development was in the city of Baltimore, and the county has this process where to do an affordable project in the county, you had to have the local county council support it. Sound familiar? So as part of the settlement to end the case, the county agreed to eliminate that requirement. And in addition to that, to create 1,000 affordable housing units in the more affluent areas of the county. So it's going to be very interesting to me to see if HUD takes this. I think it's a very substantial win for HUD and for affordable housing. And if they're going to use this to become more aggressive next year as they're doing the other components to their affirmatively furthering, and start to exercise their muscles through the courts.
Quick question. Is there any data repository that the information is being collected on all the rejects because of NIMBYism? Because in some ways I think that would be really powerful. I think the testimony of individual instances is extremely powerful as well, but if you could actually document the numbers and how frequently it's happening, and maybe there's a criteria that could be useful to demonstrate that this is what we're trying to bring in. These are the existing demographics. We're not changing the demographics by that much because NIMBYism is such an emotional issue. And if you can shift it to a data-driven issue, maybe that would help the legislators feel more comfortable and affect some sort of change. I don't know. It's just what I'm hearing. This is what...
No, I think that's an excellent point. Charlie's group has done some of that, but I think you're right. I think we have a new policy director at TAP, and that's probably a great task to have her endeavor to create. That's a great point, because you're right. I mean, a lot of times the anecdotes are great, but if we have data driven to back up our position, that duly noted. Thank you. That's good feedback.
Yeah, yeah. Chief data collector. Right
For those in the back that didn't hear that, one of our TAP members told her that she's now the chairman of that committee. So.
I think that's a great idea, and I actually now I'm going to have a conversation with our economics team to see what we might be able to do. We have done a little bit of data research on other policies that created disparate impact, but it's been difficult to show. The big challenge is if you know you're not going to get the approvals, you don't submit an application. How do we track that? And in that case, we would really need you guys to communicate that I'm not doing this. And I think part of Bobby's message is you're hearing about NIMBY issues, let them know so that they can collect these. And I think your message is right on point of we shouldn't just focus on having anecdotal stories, start making it into data points. Put it on a map and start mapping it out that I was looking at a project here and I stopped doing it because of the community opposition. I think that's a very smart approach to take. There's another question in the back.
The assessment of fair housing for the state of Texas is through May 2019, pending release of the state rule.
2019, thank you.
Have any of these assessments started at other states?
There have been a few. Only my understanding is at the local level, and our person who tracks this in depth told me the number, and I can't remember at the moment. I want to say it's around 20 some that are occurring right now, but we won't see it until really the states start going through it. I think that'll be the focus, and we were chatting a little about this before the panel. The federal government with their resources tends to pick examples of I'm going to go in and make a splash. So we think that the splash, to the extent HUD decides to do that, will more likely occur with challenging a state assessment or a large city because that's going to get the media attention and that's going to have the bigger effect. The bottom line is, as I understand it, HUD has 60 days to negatively disapprove an assessment. So if they don't say anything after 60 days is approved, by and large, most assessments are just going to be approved without comment. I think they're going to cherry pick some of the prime examples. And this is where the presidential race is going to have some fairly dramatic effects. You have obviously two very different political perspectives. So I think that will influence whether they continue to be this aggressive. We'd probably all agree with Hillary Clinton. They're likely to continue down this path and become more aggressive. Donald Trump was a little bit of a curveball because his father did get his start in affordable housing. So he has a little bit of a connection there. But we can't get any sense from him of what his housing policy is. And we've tried to engage the campaign there. I'm trying really hard to be politically neutral on that front.
What would be the impact?
Hospitality.
What do you think the impact would be of a HUD negative assessment through this process?
So HUD can reject an application, and I don't think we know yet, because as far as I know, that they haven't gone through any or certainly rejected any. So if they do it, it would be interesting. And that's the point where when they reject, if they do it on a big stage, where you're going to have the state legislature weighing in, you're going to have Congress weighing in, you're going to put a lot of attention on it, and that can also alter the political pressure that comes to bear.
Don?
And I think it's still the same. When you sign your grant and when you sign your application for your grant for homeowners, GDPs, et cetera, the last thing you sign is I approve of further housing, and then the mayor signs it or the governor signs it.
Yeah, but now you're going to have to go through a separate assessment process.
But they're going to come back and say, we don't approve your grant.
It's not going to be, my understanding is not based on the grant. It's an overarching look at how the local government in that case is affirmatively furthering. And it's more than just giving out the money. They're going to have a real meaningful plan in place that says, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and we're going to actively work to do that. And that's the difference from how it is today, where you just sign something and say, sure, we're doing it. Now you have to actually say,
I think that's always the money, the fact that they shut the money off, and I work for Houston.
Yeah.
When they shut the money off for Houston. So
yeah, that's ultimately their tool is that they can stop the flow of funds.
And there was a lawsuit filed on what he's saying in New York, I think Yonkers, where whoever legal aid or whatever filed the lawsuit said that the mayor and the city manager had committed a false statement to the federal government by signing that statement.
Wow, interesting.
That is interesting. Well, you had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted, the cut off the funds, does that include disaster recovery money? Like if we have another Ike?
So that's a good question. Most likely would not.
The city beat you.
That's usually appropriated as a separate fund, so that it would depends on how they work that in. So I don't know that I can answer that because I don't know we crossed that threshold. But it is important, and it's more than that. The most recent disasters have also included an appropriations for extra low-income housing tax credits, rebuild affordable housing, all those other things. So that's a really interesting.
with ICE, we got 3 years, 15 million a year extra for ICE. Senator Hutchinson got this vote between Monday and Friday to raise it for the Houston area.
We should probably, George, can you wait? And I'd like to make sure JP has some time. I'm sorry, or to wrap up and then.
Send it over to Bill.
All right, Bill,
Oh, yeah,
you're up.
I'm up. Good morning. I'm glad to see already that everybody has a familiarity with the NIMBY concept. Most of you are very intimately aware of it. When talking with my wife this morning, we're getting ready for work and talking about what we're going to do today, and I mentioned that I was going to be on this panel, and she said, well, what's it about? And I said, it's about NIMBY. And she said, what? And my wife is about 100 times smarter than I am on every topic except like meaningless baseball statistics. And she had no idea. So I'm glad I'm talking to a room of people that are very keenly aware of the concept. Are there any city folks in the room? Yeah? Okay, good. So some of you are familiar with TML to some extent. Let me just very briefly tell you who we are. We're a membership organization of most cities in the state, probably similarly set up to TAP, but for cities, basically. And so out of roughly 1,200 cities in the state of Texas, about 1,150 are members of TML. Quick question for you, just to put, maybe the diversity of our membership in context. Out of the 1,200 cities that are incorporated in the state of Texas, how many of those do you think have a population of 10,000 or less? Any guesses?
1,000.
I mean, you're not too far off. It's 990 have a population of 10,000 or less. So numbers-wise, the bulk of our membership are relatively small cities. But, TML, we represent everyone from Mobeetie, Texas to Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio. So the affordable housing issue is one that hits different cities differently, I guess, is the point I would make on that. Is most everyone, I mean, maybe not everyone, a large percentage of this room is developers of affordable housing. Is that fair to say? Yeah. How many of y'all enjoy dealing with your city councils? You do? All right, yeah. That's more than I thought, for sure.
I don't.
Yeah. Y'all are just trying to be nice, aren't you? Yeah, right. I mean, that's exactly it. It depends on the city.
Yeah.
If this were a room of city council members and I asked the same question, how many of you enjoy dealing with affordable housing issues? and handling the kind of outcry from citizens about NIMBY sort of concerns, you probably wouldn't get a whole lot of hands for that either. So the kind of the whole premise of dealing with these resolutions of support, when they really were codified in 2013, it was interesting because as an association, we didn't take a position on it because we had a lot of cities that came to us and said, we really don't want this authority. I mean, we don't want to be dealing with these types of issues where you have some other cities that may want to have some say in it. And one thing that we talk about when we're before the legislature, and you hear about it all the time, is this term local control, right? That now, I'm not sure what local control means anymore, to be honest. I think everybody kind of has it meaning something different depending on the situation. You see cities enacting ordinances dealing with anything from fracking bans to transportation network companies in Austin to plastic bag bans, and even sometimes see voters come out and support these things. And then you see the legislature come in and say, no, we like local control, but not that kind of local control, right? This issue is interesting from a local control standpoint because, arguably, even if the stuff in the QAP and the statute on approval, resolutions approving affordable housing projects went away, you would still have some degree of local control through land use and zoning regulations at the city level. But what Bobby mentioned earlier is that the senators took themselves out of it a few years ago. I think a lot of city officials wish they could have done the same thing, probably. The issue that cities have really with it, and I'm definitely generalizing right now, because again, we have cities that are all over the board on this, but I think that when you look at a city council member or a mayor, and you think about some of the positions that legislation puts those council members in, and I'm a little bit biased, so when I read cases about Fair Housing Act, I kind of put myself in the shoes of the city folks. And they're, by no means are they totally blameless in any of the sort of NIMBY stuff. But when you put yourself in those shoes, let's say you're a elected city council member, and you have a affordable housing, multifamily project that comes before you, and it's either the resolution of support or it's a zoning decision. And you may have a comprehensive plan that says, here's what we value. We need more affordable housing. It's a priority of the city. Here's, our comprehensive plan says it needs to meet these criteria. Our zoning ordinance is set up to where we can do it. And it's all systems go, right? And you say, okay, we can do it. And then all of a sudden you have 200 people show up at a public hearing, and they basically say, no way. Not in our backyard. We don't want it. And then as a council member, you're in a position of, okay, do we kind of change our minds on what might be a great idea and rezone it in a way that's restricting its use for affordable housing, or just decide not to adopt the resolution, or by doing so possibly risk being sued under the Fair Housing Act? Or do we decide to go ahead and do all this, and then we get unelected the next election cycle? Because if you're in a single member district, and the development is proposed to be in that district, and you have 200 people show up, it's very difficult. I would guess, I've never been an elected council member, but it would be very difficult to vote for that project when you have so many people showing up talking about how terrible it's going to be for them. So politicizing the process of the tax credit process in particular does really kind of put some city officials in a tough spot, and it makes it more difficult for the city and, of course, for the developer to achieve whatever goals that they wanted to achieve. Because all things being equal, this may be a great idea, and in fact, you may even have a lot of support from not only city officials but city staff on a project, and then you get to the point where you have a public hearing and the whole dynamic changes, basically. There were a couple of cases that I wanted to talk about, and Charlie and I had talked about last week that I thought were interesting from the city's perspective, and hopefully would be interesting to you if y'all haven't looked at some of the case law recently around this whole NIMBY concept. There are a couple of cases, one from the city of Yuma in Arizona, I think, and another from the county of Nassau and Garden City, city of Garden City. Both in 2016, these were appellate decisions, and I kind of read those cases and thought about what a city can do to make sure it's doing the right thing on affordable housing questions. Both cases kind of reached similar conclusions where they found that there was disparate treatment and even disparate impact, that the city councils in both of those cases made determinations that violated the Fair Housing Act. In both cases, and the city of Yuma case is a proposed rezoning to allow for a development of affordable multifamily housing. The Planning and Zoning Commission recommended approval. The proposed zoning change was supported by the city's comprehensive plan. Everything kind of signaled approve the project, right? This was, and the council even, the council is heading down that track. You had some public hearings, you had a lot of public outcry against it, and ultimately, this was one of 76 applications for rezoning, the only one of 76 that in a 5-year span that the council rejected. And so the court looked at the process. And so from the city's perspective, it's these sorts of issues really hinge a lot on process, because the court said, wait a second, you had one rezoning out of 76 that you rejected, and the other 75 you said were good to go. Why is that? And then they look at the actual process. They looked at the transcripts of the public hearings. And the one thing that's kind of scary, I think, for some city officials on this is that basically under a disparate treatment analysis, and this goes to, I think, what Bobby was saying earlier, most of the time, and hopefully you don't have cities now that are overtly discriminatory, that say, no, we don't want these types of people here. In this case, the council didn't say, said nothing of the sort, but they kind of attributed the code words used by the NIMBY folks that showed up at those hearings to the city council. So, the disparate treatment was basically intentional discrimination, even when the council didn't say anything, basically. That, the kind of motives of the NIMBY folks were almost imputed to the city council. So, the city council could have the best of intentions and maybe, could even do something that's totally just, political sort of, okay, we don't want to deal with this. We're not going to approve it because these folks, have gone crazy about a certain issue. And they can still be intentionally discriminating against a group of people, which, I don't think that the court got the wrong decision, made the wrong decision in this case, because clearly there has to be some way to explain this abrupt shift in process. And the same analysis was used in the Garden City case, where you had everybody. They hired a planner, they had planning and zoning, they hired an attorney, and everybody said, let's rezone it, let's put in multifamily here, affordable housing units. And then same sort of deal where you had people come out of the woodworks, basically saying this doesn't, meet the character of our community. the flavor of our community. We're going to, schools are going to be overcrowded. We have traffic issues. And don't get me wrong, I think, their cities do serve some function to make sure that, issues, traffic issues, various other sort of health and safety issues are addressed with any development. But in this case, you had council come out and actually made comments that we're in support of this project. It's going to take a lot to derail it. Of course, fast forward, it's ultimately derailed. But they came out and they actually did their homework. They worked with the developer and they said, wait a second, there's already a pre-existing use here. Traffic's not going to pick up that much. This is mostly for empty nesters and, the folks that are potentially going to be moving in here don't have school-age kids where you're not going to have your schools overcrowded or whatever the concern is. And the court looked at that and they said, okay, here's where you were. Here's what you were saying on, January 1st. And then in March, here's where you ended up. What's the reason for that, basically? And same sort of deal. They look through the record. You can find, code words of discrimination amongst any of the NIMBY folks that showed up to speak against the development, and it's Fair Housing Act violation. So city officials, at least in my opinion, can be placed in a spot where you're kind of looking at complying with the law on one hand and getting unelected on the other hand, kind of this confluence of political versus legal. What can a city do? I would say, number one, if these cases show anything, it's to have a well-formulated process. The bigger cities in Texas, you look online, some may debate whether these are good policies or not, but they certainly do have policies. It sounds like El Paso's working on one. Policies for not only for rezoning issues, but for the resolutions of support in place. And I would say follow those, follow your comprehensive plan, follow your zoning process, and maybe more than anything, listen to your staff. If a city council has a staff and everybody's saying this complies with everything we've got, we recommend approval, and then all of a sudden the council says, no, I don't think so, that raises a red flag, and then that gets to the point where you start looking into, wait, why didn't they approve this? I guess real quick before, how much time are we running out of time?
No, you're good.
Yeah.
5 or 6 minutes.
I don't know that I am in any position to recommend best practices on how to work with city councils. All of them are different, and all of you have enough experiences probably doing that where y'all may have better tips on dealing with city councils than I do. What I would say, as if asked, and in a very general sense, number one is not only communicating with the council and with city staff prior to getting the ball rolling on a development, but communicating with the folks that are going to show up and oppose it to some extent. Because if you can, as a city council member or a mayor, and you're sitting there and you have 100 people show up that are against a certain type of development, and you have a developer show up too, I think the council's looking for reasons to approve the development. And if, at least it would seem to me that if the developer has reached out to those groups to some extent and tried to address concerns about alleviating traffic and buffer zones and walls and, green space or whatever the case may be, then a city's going to look more favorably on that. The other aspect is education, really. And I think TDHCA does a good job. They have a brochure that I looked at that kind of says, here's what affordable housing is and here's what it isn't. And if you kind of want to get to the heart of NIMBYism, I think you said it, ma'am, that it is just an emotional reaction. It's not people really aren't thinking with their brains on that. It's something where, I've owned this property and I want it to be the same way that it was 10 years ago. And, it's very sort of, people have ideas of what they want their neighborhood to look like, right? And they think that affordable housing is going to somehow destroy that vision. And, TDHCA has a lot of good stuff, basically dispelling a lot of myths about affordable housing. So I don't know how you can reach the folks that are going to come out and oppose any sort of affordable housing development, but I think education in a general sense is one way to do it. The other thing I think is being very familiar with the city's policies. And that's probably the last point I'll mention is know the city's comprehensive plan, their outlook for development. I think a lot of times when you have a dispute between angry citizens and developers, citizens may be referencing the comprehensive plan to say, oh no, this is what we've decided we want in this community. And the developer's looking at the zoning ordinance and saying, but we can do this, that, and the other. If there's a working knowledge from the developer about not only the zoning ordinance, which kind of gets you from point A to point B, but here's at least what the vision of the city is, and incorporating that into the development, I think that helps a lot with the city council and city staff, and helps to sort of counteract some of the arguments you may have from the NIMBY folks. The other thing is know the council. What Charlie and I were talking about last week is he has, instances of cities that won't even put something like this on an agenda, right? They just shut it down. Hopefully there are not too many of those cities, but, certainly the sort of NIMBY mindset isn't just, held by angry citizens. There are elected officials that have the same sort of mindset. What I would say is there an agenda-setting policy in the city? If there is, know what it is and see if you can follow it and get something placed on the agenda. If there isn't, I would work on talking to every council member that might have the ability to place an item on the agenda. If nobody will do it, every council meeting has most council meetings have a citizens comment, public comment portion of the meeting. Show up and at least get it out there and get some of your arguments out there. Might it fall on deaf ears? Yes, possibly, but I don't see any harm in pushing for it. And the last thing I'll mention is economic development. I can't tell you the presentations we've done where we have cities coming up and saying, how can we increase economic development in our community? And not only, retail, commercial, I've had countless city officials come up and say, how can we get more housing in our community? And I'm like, well, your city has 200 people in it. There may not be much of a demand for housing. And, it's not that if you build it, they will come. I think there's kind of a two-way street there. But some cities, especially smaller kind of medium-sized cities, really are interested in economic development. And I think that's a strong argument coupled with, the need for a good affordable housing within the community that might sway some council members.
Great. George, did you have a question? I held you.
Mine was more for JP.
Okay.
Just really quickly, I think it's great you're here, Bill, TML, and so I'm interested to hear what you are doing to help educate those 999 cities about really what violations of not only the SCOTUS decision, because not all of them will be under the affirmative furthering fair housing, because not all of them get federal funds
Right.
to give you your home, but on the SCOTUS decision, especially when it comes to zoning, permitting, impact fees. So I'm really interested in that. And then I would also offer this opportunity to sort of cross-educate. You're here. We'd love to go to you and during one of your sessions and talk about that. I'm also on the school board in San Antonio, and going to them, to TASA and TASB, and really educating them, because it is exactly what you said about education, the unknown. And what it means, when it comes to that organization. Yeah. And the more of that sort of cross-education that we do, I think can only help, I know will only help the issue become as important as, you know, how do we build a street, how do we get better transportation, more economic development.
Yeah.
But I am really curious as to how TML is going to address that, because a lot of these smaller cities, that's where we're really having major issues.
Yeah, yeah. You know, it's a good question. So when, and you know, we've had requests. So I'll give you an example. When I think it was HB 3361, which was the bill that kind of put the letters of resolution stuff into law in 2013. When that passed, we actually, the TDHCA reached out to us, but we worked with TDHCA, and we actually had some articles drafted that we sent out in our legislative update to all of our membership about here's what you need to be thinking about, here's TDHCA stuff, and I linked to that local government brochure that they had. We have, you know, we put on education conferences, workshops throughout the year, including a big annual conference where most of our member cities show up and city officials show up in October of every year. So I know that we've had, you know, seminars within those that have kind of been targeted towards this issue. But I think we could certainly do more, and we'd love to work with y'all.
You have a panel at this year's where I'm on the panel,
Yeah.
and so is Tim Irvin. So at TML at their conference. So yeah.
My question, can you tell us what the consequences were for the city of Yuma and the county of Nassau for their violations?
I need to go back and look at the. I mean, the question was the consequences for the city of Yuma and the city of county of Nassau. I'd have to go back and look at the opinions. I mean, the both courts, and I think there may still be, you know, maybe one or both courts got remanded for further fact finding or something like that. But the appellate court in both instances found that the cities intentionally discriminated against protected groups in violation of the Fair Housing Act. And I think even there may have even been a finding of a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. So I don't know that they've been totally disposed of at this point, but suffice to say it's not looking really good for the cities of Yuma or Garden City.
I think we've pretty much run out of time, but I think the panel can stay for a few minutes, I assume, to answer questions if you all still have some. But I probably need to let you get on to the rest of the day at the conference. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.